Welcome to session 1A at the Texas Conference on Digital Libraries. My name is Lindsay Ford, and I'm the Interim Scholar Communications Librarian at University of Houston Clear Lake and a member of the TCDL Planning Committee. I am pleased to be your session moderator today. Some general housekeeping. Texas Digital Library and the TCDL Planning Committee are dedicated to providing an experience for everyone that is free from all forms of harassment and inclusive of all people. We ask that everyone here today be considerate and respectful in speech and action, attempt collaboration before conflict, refrain from demeaning, discriminatory, or harassing behavior in speech, and be mindful of your environment and of your fellow participants. You can also view our code of conduct on the homepage of the conference. Today's meeting will run until approximately 11:50. Please feel free to take breaks as you need. I invite you to say hello in chat and let us know where you're joining from, share resources, make comments about today's workshop. You're also encouraged to post your questions in the Q&A section, where you can also vote on other questions you'd like the speakers to answer. I will be watching for your questions in Q&A, and our presenter has someone to help him do that as well. And now on with the show. I am pleased to introduce David Wilcox. I will hand things over to you now to go ahead and get started.
Great, thanks very much. Hi, I'm David Wilcox. I'm the program leader for Fedora at Lyrasis. My colleague Aaron Griffith, who's the program coordinator for Fedora, is joining me here today. Aaron's going to assist with kind of monitoring questions and kind of jumping in whenever needed to get me to answer something. I'll share a link just off the top here. So these slides are open for anyone who would like to access them, and it's helpful during the workshop to have those in front of you. So let me just post in the chat here if I can get to it. I'm actually not seeing the Zoom chat. Maybe I'll just put it in Whova. There we go. It's also in the Google Doc for the session, but I'll jump in here. So I'm going to do kind of a bit of an intro here with some slides, and then there is a hands-on section for this workshop as well that you're welcome to participate in if you'd like, or you can just watch the demo if you'd prefer to do that. But let me get started. So this is really an introductory workshop. Just meant to provide kind of an overview of Fedora 6.0. So just trying to show what Fedora can do for you, some of the key capabilities that the software offers, and also an opportunity to get a little bit of hands-on experience. So right off the top, this is an introductory workshop, so I wanted to provide kind of an overview of Fedora itself before we get into sort of the nuts and bolts of the different features and how the software works. Fundamentally, Fedora is open source repository software that stores, preserves, and provides access to digital objects. And it supports flexible content models for those objects, so you can really store kind of anything you want, model it any way that's appropriate for your institution. So there's a lot of flexibility there. And it does this primarily through linked data, so using semantic relationships between objects for how you sort of build them up and represent them. And I'll have some examples of that as we get going here. And it's designed to support millions of objects, both large and small, so no particular kind of limits there. And really designed as well to interoperate with other applications and services. That's one of the kind of key features of Fedora, is sort of a robust API and an ability to interact with a lot of different applications that you might have in your repository ecosystem. And I'll just to mention, if you do have questions throughout the presentation here and throughout the workshop, feel free to drop those in at any time into the chat or the Q&A feature. Aaron's going to try to keep an eye on that stuff, and I'll try to answer questions as we go for anyone that might have some. So in terms of just the value proposition, why use Fedora as opposed to other similar pieces of software? There's a few reasons. Flexibility, I think, is one of the main things that Fedora offers. It handles both simple and complex use cases. So even if your use cases are fairly simple to begin with, they tend to kind of grow in complexity over time. And Fedora is really designed to be able to kind of adapt to that complexity as you go. But content in Fedora is also durable, and this really is one of the main kind of reasons why I think a lot of people use Fedora is for that digital preservation component, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the features that it offers in that direction. But that's another major use case for the system. And it's used by hundreds of institutions all over the world. So anytime you're adopting open source software, it's typically important to know that it's used fairly widely, and that it's not just a kind of project that only a handful of institutions are using. It's also designed to be very standards based, and this has only gotten more true over time. And so if you're using Fedora, it's designed in such a way that if you ever wanted to stop using it, it's fairly easy to get your content out in standardized ways. So there's no kind of lock-in that you sometimes get with sort of vendor-run systems. And I think one of the most important features really of Fedora is the community. So there is this kind of large and thriving community around the project, lots of people using it. And so you can get support in all kinds of different ways through the mailing list, through Slack, and also through training opportunities like this, where we put on workshops fairly often and try to provide good sort of working knowledge of the software. And this workshop in particular is focusing on version 6.0. So this one is currently in beta, but is going to be in production within the next month or so. And this new version of the software offers a variety of features that we think are pretty compelling. One is sort of enhanced digital preservation capabilities. We've adopted a new standard called the Oxford Common File Layout for how things are sort of stored and laid out on disk. That's kind of in line with digital preservation best practices. And we've also built a number of migration tools and documentation support for that, so that folks can get from earlier versions of the software to this new version without too much difficulty. We've added a simple search capability into the software, so it's easier to find things in the repository. It's often people use kind of more robust external search tools like Solr, but we do have a simple one for kind of common search activities within the repository. We've done a lot of work on improving the performance and scale relative to previous versions of the software. That's really been borne out with a number of tests that we've been running. And we've also added capabilities for collecting and monitoring different kind of metrics within the repository and reporting out on that, so you can sort of troubleshoot any issues that might be arising, or just kind of see how well the software is performing under different kind of load scenarios. And if you're familiar with some of these other community projects, Fedora is often thought of as a kind of middleware application. So it doesn't really have much of a front end itself. It has a fairly simple HTML user interface that we'll get a chance to play around with in this workshop. But typically Fedora is used in conjunction with other software packages. So Samvera and Islandora are two fairly well-known, widely adopted community projects, and often Fedora is used in the context of those systems. So it kind of provides that storage and persistence backend, whereas these other software applications provide all the kind of nice user-facing features that people would expect to have for their repository. So I'll share just a few examples of sort of Fedora sites as they exist out in the wild today, just supporting a variety of use cases. And I've included the URLs here. These are all public sites, so you'd be welcome to visit them if you want to take a look and see sort of how these sites work. So institutional repository use cases are fairly common. This is just one example out of George Washington University. And this is built using a Samvera application stack. So Fedora on the back end, of course, but the front end is based on Samvera. And it has, a set of features around institutional repository use cases, self-deposit, and those sorts of things that you might expect with that kind of application. The same kind of Samvera software stack can be used to build other use cases. So this is one focused more on research data. This is out of the University of Michigan. There's the URL there if you want to check that one out. Newspapers and other sort of paged content is always also very common. The site of the University of Maryland is actually a custom interface on top of Fedora, so it's not using Samvera or Islandora. It's one that they've built using their own code base, which is another fairly common use case with Fedora. You can use Islandora or Samvera, but you're also able to build your own sort of interfaces on top of it. This is just an example of an Islandora site in New Zealand that's sort of kind of a special collections site, has a kind of a nice translated interface, and supports a wide variety of different content types. And these are really just meant to provide a few examples if you want to go take a look and see sort of what Fedora sites kind of look like. The interfaces are all totally different. Really what's common here is just kind of the back end storage and persistence layer where the content is actually kept and modeled and preserved. So with that, I'm going to talk about some of the fundamental concepts, and then we'll jump into some hands-on work fairly quickly so you can sort of see how everything works for yourself. So everything in Fedora is a resource, or more specifically a web resource. And that means that everything has an identifier, a URI. So it's you can plug it into your web browser and go to that resource. You can of course apply security. Not everything has to be on the open web, but everything you create within Fedora is a resource with an identifier. And there are two main types of resources. There's containers, which generally are sort of metadata resources, and binaries, which are your files. So PDFs, video files, images, what have you. And so really fundamentally, everything in the repository is one of these two things. All of these resources can also be described. They can have properties associated with them, and these properties are expressed as RDF triple. So this is linked data. This is a short workshop, so we're not really doing a sort of linked data intro here. But if you're familiar with some of the basic concepts, basically, you have these resources and they're described by RDF triples. And resources can contain other resources, so you can build up a kind of a hierarchy within your repository with a kind of a system of containers and binaries. And we'll show an example here so you can kind of get a sense of how that tends to work. And that's what this is. So this is just taking an example of a book, any kind of paged content. You can model things in sort of a variety of ways, but here's an example of one sort of common way to model a book. And again, you just have containers and binaries. Everything is sort of one or the other. So starting sort of on the left-hand side here, there's the book collection, which is itself a container, and it probably has some kind of lightweight metadata describing it. And then within that collection, you might have a couple of books, which at the top level are themselves containers and would have metadata with regard to the title and author and what have you. And then those books contain pages. Then here's where you can make some modeling decisions. In some cases, you might just have binary files representing the pages, but you may also have metadata that describes them. And so in this case, each of the pages is itself a container that might have its own metadata. And then finally, at the bottom, you have sort of the actual files, the TIFF or JPEG images that represent the pages themselves. And so this is sort of one common way of laying out a book, and Fedora supports this. Lots of other pieces of software would also support this kind of scenario. But you actually also have a lot more flexibility with regard to how things are modeled. So all of these connections, and this is true in the previous slide as well, are really just kind of RDF relationships. So you can have the books sort of in a hierarchical sort of structure, but you can also have scenarios where pages belong to more than one book or books belong to more than one collection. And so you don't have to structure everything in a completely hierarchical way. You can actually use some of these powerful RDF relationships to build different linkages between things without sort of copying and pasting files all over the place. So I think this type of setup is far more common. Most of the use cases for Fedora, I think, are fairly hierarchical in nature, but we do have some repositories that have other use cases where, again, you just have contents that's shared across different resources, whether it's within collections or books or what have you. And Fedora sort of supports both of those types of scenarios because you can sort of organize things with these relationships. And this is just a quick screenshot of what things actually look like in the repository. So if you had a page file, this is an example of a binary file, and it has a set of properties that describe it, the MIME type, the file size, the file name, those sorts of things. And as I said before, all of this work is being done in corresponding with a set of standards. So there's a link in these slides if you want to take a look at the actual specification for the Fedora API. So that the API is itself a standard, and that's something that we've committed to going forward. And the Fedora API really is itself kind of a collection of other standards. And this is something that we believe a lot in, is trying to do things in a standardized way, having fewer customizations that we have to maintain, and making the software easier to kind of interact with other programs out there, and giving us opportunities to participate in other sort of related communities that are doing similar work. Okay, a little bit about the core features, and then we'll get to look at some of this stuff hands-on. Again, feel free to drop questions in, and Aaron, if you're keeping an eye on things, just kind of feel free to stop me here if there are any questions that come in. So I'm going to pause on this slide for a moment. There's kind of a lot of information on here that I'll unpack, and then we'll kind of go through each of these in turn. But fundamentally, these are really the core features, the services and standards that Fedora offers. So on the left in bold are the sort of the services or the features, and on the right in the sort of gray text is the standard that we're using in order to implement that feature. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on these standards. You can go take a look at them if you're interested. The main point of this slide is just to illustrate that each of the things that Fedora does, it does in a standardized way, with the exception for now of the simple search. That one is fairly custom, but the rest of these all have sort of standards associated with them. So there's the basic kind of create, read, update, delete, what's sometimes called CRUD operations, but that's just sort of your resource management within the repository. We're using the linked data platform for that. Fedora also does versioning, which we're using the Memento standard for. Authorization, so security within the repository is done using web access control. Fedora does Fixity, which is the kind of digital preservation functionality using some of these HTTP standards. And then messaging as well, which we'll talk about sort of later in this presentation. That's being done with activity streams. So if you're not familiar with these standards, don't worry about them too much. I'm going to move on from this and kind of go into more detail on each of these features to sort of unpack them and show how they work. But the point of this slide, again, is just to illustrate that each of these is being done in accordance with a standard that sort of goes beyond Fedora itself and has its own sort of community around it. So let's take a look at each of these features. The CRUD, as I said, the create, read, update, delete. And this is really just a pattern for how you create and manage resources within the repository, but also how you can model content and create, for example, the book that we saw earlier, or really anything else. And so this is kind of the main way that you can manage resources within Fedora. There are a couple of common ways to do this. We're going to use the HTML interface. So this is sort of a minimal view on sort of the repository, but it does use the API. For developers, you can also do all this stuff on a command line using things like curl. And for applications like Islandora and Samvera, they're kind of doing this under the cover, but they're just sort of interacting with the API directly. So, for the hands-on portions here, we're going to be just kind of showing how things happen in Fedora. In the real world, you're probably not going to be very commonly doing these sort of manual operations within the repository, but it's good to know how it works and how sort of under the covers Fedora operates to help better understand the kind of functionality of the application stack that you might be using. Okay, so we're going to switch gears here and do a bit of hands-on stuff. You're welcome to do this or not. If you'd prefer just to sort of follow along watching the demo, you can do that. I'm going to share, there's a link in the slides to a spreadsheet here, which I'll also share in Whova, and so put it in the chat. So that spreadsheet should be open. Basically, these are all just sandbox sites. And if you'd like to use one, just drop your initials beside it to claim it so that no one else grabs that particular instance. And then you can copy the URL and paste it into your browser, open up a new browser tab. It's going to ask you for a username and a password, which are here. It's just Fedora admin with the A in admin capitalized. That's both the username and the password. I'll give folks a a few minutes here to grab a URL if you want. Again, just remember to put your initials beside the URL just so no one else claims it. And these are all basically sites that we set up. You should get to this kind of landing page if you put it into your browser. We won't be able to do a ton of troubleshooting here, but hopefully this works for everyone. So this was we put these sites up using a tool that we developed internally. They're basically all just hosted in Amazon AWS. Fairly inexpensively, and we have a tool that we can use now that's open for anyone else who is also kind of interested in deploying Fedora in AWS. Where just yesterday I had a colleague of mine spin up about 100 of these instances, all just with one simple script. It's fairly easy to do, and then tomorrow after the workshop we'll kind of tear all these down again. So these aren't going to be permanent. Feel free to play around with them, but they'll go away probably sometime tomorrow. But if you'd like to continue using Fedora and playing around with these instances, there are lots of ways to deploy it on your desktop. There's a kind of a one-click application that you can deploy. There's a Docker version of it. So lots of ways to sort of get up and running, and feel free to send me a message if you're not sure how to do any of that kind of stuff. But hopefully that gives everyone see a number of you have claimed instances, so that's great. And Aaron, just let me know if there's any kind of issues popping up in the chat. Again, you don't have to do this. This is really just available for you if you'd like to participate in the hands-on sections here.
Sorry, David, did you grabbed your own instance there, or were you reserving the first one?
No, I have my own. I took mine off.
Okay, great.
Okay, so I'll give it just maybe another 30 seconds or so, and then I'll proceed with the workshop here. This slide here as well is really just meant as a kind of a cheat sheet, as it says on here. This is more for developers and folks that are sort of comfortable on the command line and are familiar with REST APIs. If that's not you, don't worry too much about this. But it's really just meant to show how when we're browsing the interface, we are actually using the API directly. So this isn't sort of some separate application or website that we've set up. It's just a kind of visual way of interacting with the API the same way that you would on the command line. So that's really just meant to kind of illustrate that. And there's a link to the documentation for the API if you want to sort of dig into the details there and learn a little bit more about it. And you'll see on each of these slides, I've got a set of instructions that is sort of in bullet form at the top, and then on the bottom there's this kind of bubble with a command that's that you would put in use on the command line. So this is really just meant to kind of provide two windows on how this stuff works. We're just going to walk through the sort of visual steps using the HTML interface. But again, for developers, folks that are familiar with kind of working on the command line, the stuff that appears at the bottom is just sort of the equivalent way of doing this if you were to kind of do it on the command line. And feel free to give that a try too if you like, but we're going to be focused on sort of this more kind of visual way of doing things, just because it's a little bit easier in a kind of a workshop context. So I'm going to be kind of flipping back and forth a little bit here. You may, if you're kind of trying to follow along, want to have your Zoom window sort of off to one side and your browser sort of on another part of your screen. It's a little bit harder to do these kinds of workshops in a virtual environment just because you need a lot of screen real estate to be able to kind of comfortably move around, but we'll do our best here. So when you get to your site, after you put in your username and password, you should be able to just click this Fedora REST API endpoint button. and go to sort of the landing page of the site. And so this really is just kind of the top level of this Fedora repository. It is itself a resource. And so this is a container that has a creation and modification date and a few other properties that are really just kind of describing what it is. You know, it's a container, it's a resource, it's the repository root, those sorts of things. And then off on the right here are basically all the controls which we'll be playing around with today. So there's sort of creating new resources. You can create resources of different types. You can give them identifiers or have identifiers generated automatically. And you can also update properties using RDF. So we'll walk through these things and feel free to sort of follow along here. I'm going to create a new basic container resource at the top level. And I'm just going to call it image collection. So let me go ahead and do that. These other types here, we're going to be focused on basic containers and binaries. These other types here are sort of more advanced features that we're not going to cover today. But the most common ways that folks use Fedora is with the containers, the basic containers and binaries. So that's what we're going to focus on. So again, I'm going to call this one image-collection. This RDF box is if you wanted to pre-populate this resource with a description. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to hit the add button. And when you do, it will take you to this new resource that you've created. So there's a little breadcrumb trail so you can sort of see where you are. And the URL is based on the identifier that we gave this resource. And then it has just kind of a basic set of properties that describe it. So I'm going to go now create another basic container within this image collection container, and I'm going to call this one Andromeda-Galaxy. So again, same thing. I'm here. I'm going to create a basic container, and I'm going to name it Andromeda Galaxy. Feel free to copy and paste from the slides too, if that's easier for you. So you can see here we're building up just kind of a basic basic hierarchy in the repository. You've got your image collection and then Andromeda Galaxy, and then you can navigate back and forth using the breadcrumb trail here. So it kind of shows you where you are in your repository. Some of these slides are a little bit informational, just if you want to ever go back and take a look at them. So this one is really just describing kind of what's going on here. So, you know, we're doing, right now we're sort of creating resources, and then it's kind of whenever you create it, it's sort of giving it back to you, which is the equivalent of kind of a get command that you would use in the context of an API. So that's containers. Now we're going to add a binary file. You can really upload whatever you want. I have a link here to an image that you can use if you want, or you can just upload, you know, a file off of your desktop. It's really up to you. I've already saved this locally, and then on this slide, within this Andromeda Galaxy container, I'm going to upload a new binary file, and I'm going to call it Andromeda.jpg. So over here within Andromeda Galaxy, I'm going to drop down the type menu and choose binary. As soon as I do that, it adds this file upload, which I'm going to use. First, I'm going to name this Andromeda.jpg, which is going to be the identifier for this resource. And then I'm going to go browse for this. And hit the add button. And again, you can upload whatever you want here. This is just for kind of testing purposes, but you can see here I get a slightly different view on the interface now. I've uploaded a binary file, so it has a little bit of a different set of properties. It includes the file name and the MIME type, as well as some information on things like the fixity of the resource, which we'll talk about shortly. It also gives you the option to download the content directly or check the fixity, which again we'll do here in the next part of the workshop. And again, this is just kind of describing what's going on here. So next I'm going to update the RDF properties. So we've done the sort of create and the read. Here we're going to do an update to show how that works. There are lots of ways to kind of do this. We're going to do something fairly simple here. And actually, I think I have to just briefly drop out of this, this view so I can actually copy and paste. So here I'm just going to, I'm going to go to this, I'm going to go back a step to the Andromeda Galaxy container that I created, and then I'm going to insert this this statement. So this is using a Sparkle, which is a Sparkle update, I should say, which is a kind of a language that's built around dealing with RDF. And here we're going to insert basically just a Dublin core title. And all this statement is saying is the sort of open and close bracket just means on this particular resource, insert a DC title, and we're going to call that Andromeda Galaxy. So if you want to try this out, the easiest thing to do is just to kind of copy and paste from the slides if you happen to have those open. That way you don't mistype anything. So I'm going to go back a step from Andromeda JPEG to Andromeda Galaxy. Refresh this too. Okay. Then I'm going to go down to the update properties box, all the way to the bottom of that. So this is basically just full of various RDF ontologies that you can use. It's just kind of a template so that you don't have to go find all of these if you wanted to use them. Dublin core is already in this list. It's right here at the bottom. And I'm just going to replace this delete insert where with the statement from the slides. So again, just inserting a title. And then if I click the update button, you can see now that there is a DC title here, and actually it changes sort of the text at the top just to, because we've given it a title, although the URL is still the same. It's right there in the top of the browser. And again, that's just kind of showing what's going on there. Let me see if I can go back into a presentation mode here quickly. Okay, and then the last step is to actually delete the resource. So I'm going to go back to that JPEG that we created and just delete that to show sort of what's going on there. So if I go here to Andromeda Galaxy, you may need to refresh your page if you don't see this. Sometimes browsers will cache things. So, but if you're on the Andromeda Galaxy resource that we just operated on, you should see here children, which is what shows sort of the child resources underneath this resource. And it has this Andromeda JPEG that we created. So I'm going to click that, and then it goes into, again, the same view that we saw before. And on the very bottom, I'm going to hit the delete button. So this really will delete the resource. So it's gone. Now, typically, if you were doing this in a, say, an Islandora or a Samvera context, there would be some secure, some controls there to make sure you don't accidentally delete things. Here we're sort of operating directly on the REST API. So delete really is just the equivalent of kind of issuing that that delete command. And since that resource is gone now, if we try to go back and visit it, so if I try to click this andromeda.jpg link, I'll just increase here so you can see. What I get is what we've called a tombstone, which is essentially just a little piece of text that says that something used to be here, but it's gone now, and here's when it was deleted. And this is really just kind of a sort of linked data best practice. If you've got a live repository and you've published a URL for something, then you really don't want to reuse that URL for something totally different, because someone might have cited it in a paper or just linked to it, and if the thing they linked to is gone and turns into something else, that can be really disruptive. So we've kind of put this in as a kind of a protection to prevent URLs from being reused. You can delete the tombstone and reuse the URL if you want to, and in a development environment, you might be doing that because you're sort of creating and deleting stuff all the time for testing. But generally speaking, in production, it's best not to reuse these URLs. And that is basically how it works for the sort of create, read, update, delete operations. So that's basic repository management. Those are the different types of resources that you can create, how to create them, update them, and delete them. Now we're going to explore some of the other features that Fedora offers in some sort of the time remaining here. So the next one I wanted to talk about is versioning. And versions are created either automatically or on demand. So basically, as you're sort of operating in your repository and you're making changes, you can create versions to sort of track those changes and kind of keep a history. By default, in these instances, versioning is kind of turned on automatically. So we are, every time we're making a change, we are automatically creating new versions. But you can disable it and then have it just operate sort of whenever you want. So you can sort of manually create versions. And then these get retrieved via the Memento protocols. This is kind of a really interesting standard that is used elsewhere on the web by things like the Wayback Machine, where you can request a version of a resource at or near a particular date and time and get it back. And so that Fedora supports this now. So if you sort of request a resource at a particular time, it will respond the same way. You know, as it says here, the Internet Archive, you know, British Library, some of these other sites will do. So a version is itself a type of resource. So it has its own identifier. You can link to it, you can retrieve it. And it's basically a snapshot. It contains the contents of a resource at a point in time. And it's immutable. So you can restore versions or delete them, but you can't change them after they've been made. It's basically, you know, just a copy of a resource at a point in time. So it has a date associated with it down to the second, which is part of the Memento standard. It's discoverable, so you can sort of query a resource and say, does this resource have any versions? And Fedora will respond with a list of those versions. And there's a versioning API that's used to create these. So it's not, you don't create versions in the same way as you create other resources. Although, as I said, in this case, it's turned on automatically. So the versions are being created sort of alongside other changes that we're making. There's just a link here if you want to read up more about the Memento specification if you're interested in it. We're not going to cover it in detail in this workshop, other than just this very sort of high-level picture of how this works. So in the case of Memento, the version itself is referred to as a memento. There is a time gate, which is sort of where you sort of query for resources or for mementos, and a time map, which is a list of those mementos. And then, of course, the original resources, which is the thing that we're operating on, that we're creating versions from. So we can see this in action in the repository. I'm going to go back to my image collection resource and create a new container there. And just call it map, just to sort of create something new. So I'll just use the breadcrumb trail here. I'll go back to image collection and then go down to basic container here and create a new one. And I'm going to call this one map and then hit the add button. So I've got this new resource, image collection / map. And here's just illustrating that versions can be created, but it's auto versioning is enabled on this particular site. And we can go take a look before we modify it. If you go down on any of these resources, you'll see this versioning section. It'll tell you here that auto versioning is enabled. So if I click view versions, there's just one, which is the one that we've just created, and it has that kind of it has its own URL, it has a date time, and it will tell you that it cannot be modified. So if I go back to the map resource and then modify that, so here I'm just giving it a title of map of Nova Scotia, which is where I live, and you can copy and paste that from the slides, or see if I can manually insert that here. So I've just updated this resource. I've given it a title, and if I now go down to the list of versions and click View Versions, you can see here now that it has 2 versions. So every time we're changing it, it's giving us a new snapshot. So here, this is the version that has the title. And if I go back, this is the version that does not have the title. And that'll happen basically every time we make changes in the repository. So you can look at any of the resources in here, and they'll all have these version histories. And then if you need to, you can always roll back to a previous version. So there's lots more you can do with versions. Again, this is just sort of an introductory workshop. So there's a link here if you want to take a look at the documentation around versioning. There's a lot that you can do around sort of getting the full list and finding the closest version to a specific date, and other sort of things that you can do, restoring a version to replace the current resource. And there's lots of reasons why you might want to do versioning in the context of a repository. If you're tracking changes, then if someone makes a mistake, you can always roll back to a previous version. And it's also kind of best practice from a digital preservation perspective to mint versions of resources and keep those snapshots sort of as immutable, an immutable history of all the changes that have occurred throughout time for that resource. So that's sort of what's going on here. We're not going to do hands-on authorization, but I'll talk briefly about sort of how authorization works. It's again, the standard here is web access control. This comes from the W3C, or the Worldwide Web Consortium. And it's sort of an approach using linked data for managing authorization of resources. So you can define users and groups and say who gets to access what resources, and that sort of basic kind of authorization stuff. It's an interoperable standard, so it's possible to work with other applications that use it. We'll briefly demo Fixity here. So Fixity is something that's pretty important for digital preservation. So recognizing that over time, digital objects can become corrupt. And a lot of us have seen this happen if you ever try to kind of load up old media on a CD or a floppy disk or something like that, and find that the files are not accessible anymore, not loading the way that you would expect them to. And this can just happen over time. You can get digital objects becoming corrupt. And so Fixity checks can really help kind of preserve those objects by verifying that they're still the same object that you think they are. So Fedora allows you to do that. It provides a couple of mechanisms here. So when you put something into Fedora for the first time, you can provide a checksum along with it, and Fedora will calculate the checksum of the thing you ingested and compare it to what you said the checksum is supposed to be, and let you know if there's a mismatch there, which would imply that the file was corrupted sometime before you put it into Fedora. But then every time you put something in, Fedora will retain that checksum, and then on demand, you can have Fedora recalculate and compare a checksum at any time. So you can have operations that go through the repository and verify that nothing has become corrupted over time. There are some limitations here, of course. This really is just a check. It's if you still have to have a plan for what you will do if a Fixity check fails and you have a bad binary file in the repository. This is one use case for versions. So if you're sort of maintaining that version history, you might be able to roll back to a previous version if the latest version is corrupt. But also having a good backup strategy. So if you needed to sort of pull a file out of a backup and restore from there. So either of those things can work, but it's good to have some kind of a strategy for what happens if you do happen to encounter a bad checksum. And it's worth noting here that this only works for stuff that Fedora is managing in the repository. So you can have content that's stored elsewhere and just referenced in Fedora. But in that case, Fedora is not going to be able to manage the fixity of those items. So you'd have to maintain that separately. And it does support a few different digest algorithms that are fairly commonly used. And actually SHA 512 is on this list now as well. So we can do a little bit of hands-on here just to see how this works in practice. I've got another file you can download, or you can just, again, upload kind of whatever you want to try it out. And then I'm going to go create a new file. I'm going to call it parade.jpg and put it into the repository. So going back here, I'm going to click on image collection in the breadcrumb trail, and then I'm going to create a new resource here, a binary resource called parade.jpg. So flip the type down to binary, and under identifier, parade.jpg. And then I'm just going to browse for that file, which I have here, and hit the add button. So this should all work fairly quickly, but that file is now in the repository. Again, has all these properties with it, one of which is the checksum. So that's this long string of letters and numbers here. So that's what Fedora recorded on ingest. And then if I click this Fixity button, it's actually running a calculation when I click that button. And it will give me an event outcome of success and report the message, the digest or the checksum, and the file size. So if there was a mismatch, then it would report that as well as a Fixity failure, and that the file has a bad checksum or a bad file size, or both, most likely both. So that's fairly basic, but that's how Fixity checking works. And again, really, this is just sort of one part of sort of a preservation tool set that helps make sure that your files or resources are sort of stable over the long term. So now for a new feature, this is the simple search. So this is one that was recently added and allows you to kind of query the repository directly to find things. So it supports really basic queries. It's built into Fedora, and it's based on an internal database index that gets set up when you first set up your repository. So here, this is the HTML search interface. There's a little search button at the top that you can click, and then it'll kind of display a default query. So if I'm in my repository here, there's a search button at the top, and if I click that, it's sort of by default just sort of queries everything in the repository and gives it to you in a little table here. And then it just kind of gives you different sort of fields that you can search on, different operators, and a query box here. This is all documented on the wiki, which if I don't have a link in here, I will add one. But the various kind of queries you can run are those are all documented, so you can sort of figure out how this works. But we've got a couple of sample ones here that we can try. So if we wanted to find the map resource, for example, search on the Fedora ID with an equals operator. And I've just got the asterisk here saying, give me anything with that ends in map. So if I flip over here, it's already set on Fedora ID, but if I change the operator to equals, and then here, just do star map, hit submit. So it gives me back this map resource. So there's a link to it where you can go find it, and just gives you a little bit of information on sort of the RDF types, how big it is, when it was created, and when it was last modified. So that's fairly simple, which is the intention of this kind of service. And there are a variety of things that you can search on. I think I have another example here of searching on MIME type. So this is, let's see if we can find that parade resource by searching for the MIME type. So here I'm going to again do the equivalent and do an asterisk with JPEG to find anything that ends in that MIME type. So I'll go to the field, select MIME type. The operator I'm going to stay still equals, and I'll just change the query to JPEG and submit. And so it found this the parade JPEG that we uploaded. So it has all the RDF types, the content size, in this case the MIME type because it has one, and the created and last modified dates. So there's lots more you can do with the search service that's really just meant to provide couple of brief examples, and this is mostly going to be used by repository administrators or developers that are kind of working internally with the repository and trying to very quickly find particular pieces of content. For sort of production search scenarios, you're most likely going to use something external like Solr or Elasticsearch, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. But we're not sort of trying to replicate those services. We're just trying to provide a kind of simple internal tool. And again, just let me know if there's questions as we're going along here. Here, I just wanted to cover the last of the sort of features on the list, which is messaging. And this is really, it's pretty powerful. This is how you can build up a more kind of a large asynchronous kind of repository ecosystem with a variety of services that's very fault tolerant and robust. So when I'm talking about asynchronous integrations here, basically every time you do anything meaningful in the repository, anytime you create or update or delete something, Fedora emits a message, and that message can just sort of go off and have nothing happen to it. But I'll talk about the external services here in a moment. But you can have things that are set up to listen for those messages and then operate on them. So it's asynchronous in the sense that Fedora isn't going to wait to see what happens. Fedora just sends the message out and then sort of goes on with its business. But if there's a service listening to catch those messages, you can do interesting things. So I have a couple of examples here. So again, you have these sort of external services that are listening for messages, which trigger services, and this is intended to be kind of a robust way of doing things. So I gave the example earlier of indexing or for external search applications. So we have tooling that does this already based off of a service called Camel, which is an Apache project. And basically you can just set this up, and then anytime anything changes in the repository, a message gets picked up and sent to the search index, and then it gets updated. And what's nice about this is it's not dependent on Fedora, and Fedora is not dependent on it. So you could, delete the search index and then re-index it from Fedora, and it's really no problem because all of the information is still stored in Fedora. And yeah, Solr and Elasticsearch are fairly common ways of doing this. But Fedora also uses linked data, and if you have an interest in sort of being able to query that linked data in sort of more complex ways, you can set up an external triple store. And again, this is the tooling for doing this is all sort of available. You don't have to write any code, and you can use a variety of triple stores, which again is nice because not all triple stores are the same. And you're really just indexing from Fedora. So if you have to, you can get rid of one and use a different one. And none of that is sort of dependent on Fedora itself. So there's lots of different tools out there, and you can sort of set up these external indices. There's sometimes some confusion, I should say, that Fedora does store triples, but is not itself a triple store. And that's just because a triple store has a very specific meaning. As it's saying here, you can do kind of complex queries using Sparkle query. And Fedora doesn't support the sort of querying of RDF, it just stores it. But that's why setting up an external triple store is pretty easy. And if you have a use case for querying the RDF, Fedora will support that, but it's just sort of done through this external triple store index. Okay, so I wanted to just sort of conclude here with a little bit on the roadmap, what's next for Fedora, and then we do have time for questions, or I can go back and cover any of anything I've already touched on. There's lots of time left, but I don't think we'll need to use the entire time allotted here. So if you haven't been following along too closely, we are in the process of releasing Fedora 6.0, which is what we've been using in the workshop here today. We got into an alpha release in December and then followed that fairly quickly with a beta in February. And for the last couple of months, we've been sort of testing the beta and working out the kinks. And we're just about ready to put out a release candidate quite likely by the end of this month, and then a full release next month. So you can expect that to be available here pretty soon. There are some links that I'll include if you'd like to take a look at any of the things that we've been developing here. If you're using Fedora already in a previous version, we've done a lot of work to try to make sure that the migration tools are robust and well documented. And so we have tooling that you can use if you have a custom interface, or if you happen to be using a system like Islandora, there's a set of tools for that as well. Feel free to drop me a message if you're sort of curious about any of that kind of stuff. We have toolings and also a validation tool that can verify that the content has come across without anything missing or corrupted. So these are all available for testing now. I want to just quickly say thank you to all of our members. Fedora is a open source, community supported project, and my position and Aaron's and everything else that we do with regard to training and software development and support is only possible because we have all these great member institutions that support us financially every year. So I want to say thank you to these institutions, and also encourage anyone who's a Fedora user that's not yet a member to consider joining and supporting us. It's really the only way that we can continue ensuring that the software is sustainable over time. And I have a few links here as well if you want to check out the documentation or get involved with anything that we're doing. We have mailing list and Slack channels and email, other ways to kind of communicate with us. We're always happy to hear from folks, and if there's questions or anything that we can point you to that's going to help with Fedora, then definitely let us know. But I think I'll stop here, and I haven't seen any questions yet, and Aaron, if there is anything sort of coming through, let me know. But this is sort of the end of the formal workshop program, so if there's questions, definitely let us know. But I'll kind of stop talking here and just see if there are any.
There's nothing in the chat yet, but now that you've opened it up.
Yeah, we'll give it a minute here. Just if folks do have questions, feel free to drop those in, and then you know, we'll definitely wrap things up here if there aren't any questions. Those instances you can feel free to use for a little while, but they'll probably be gone by tomorrow. But if you'd like a link to any of the other sort of local tools that you can use to set up Fedora, you can drop me a message in the Whova chat or send me an email or whatever, and we'll get you set up with those. But it's relatively easy to deploy and use locally if you wanted to do some testing, try it out, anything like that. Aaron, I don't know if there's anything else we wanted to sort of share with folks or point people to before we close things out for the day.
I put in the chat there just the link to the wiki with all the resources that you were mentioning there. So that's all there. I dropped in the membership information where people can have a look at that. Otherwise, I mean, my pitch is always, I encourage you guys to sign up for, join our Slack channel, sign up for our communication mailing list. We have a very active community in Fedora, very engaged, very active. So a great resource also for support and help if you need, if you are working on something and need anything. The community is very engaged.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. And I think we'll check back on the Whova chat as well. So if something does occur to you, feel free to drop it in there. We can always respond after the workshop. But if there's nothing else in there, I'll just say thanks everyone for attending and for your attention. And Lindsay, I don't know if there's anything particular you wanted to do to sort of close out the session.
Actually, there is. I just wanted to thank you all as well for joining us today. I'd like to encourage everyone here to join us for upcoming TCDL sessions, and please take a look at our poster presenters. Here are a few that might interest you. Let's see if I can paste those. Oh, that was super helpful. I'll try that again. I'll also encourage you to participate in our poster scavenger hunt. You can take the quiz online, and I'll paste this. This should work for all in the chat. Let's see. And then finally, TCDL is looking to gauge interest in forming a new membership group around research integrity. And this is building on the success of our brief research integrity workshop series back in February. We have a survey for you to take, which will help us iron out some details in this group. And here is another link that will go into chat as well. And that's about all I have. So thank you.
Great. Yeah. Well, thanks again, everyone, for joining. Feel free to get in touch with us if you do have any questions. But otherwise, yeah, enjoy the rest of the conference.